So let's talk a little bit about quoting, right? You've got quotes, you've got SOWs, you have RFPs. What's the difference and how should you be approaching each one? Well, I've dealt with all of these a ton over the last 20 years for my businesses, the businesses that I worked for, and those that I consulted with. And I want to start and just do a high-level overview of each one of these and a few things that you can do when you're prepping and delivering each one of these types of pricing that will set you up for maximum success. So first, let's start with quoting, right? So a quote is really going to be literally just that, okay? You or the customer know exactly what they want and they say, hey, I just need a quote for 30 of these things. It's model number, blah, 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 right? Now, most of the time you don't have to do a ton of selling with that, but at the same time, obviously there's selling involved to get on that list to get a quote, but you also have to know, is it appropriate just to send out a quote? Or should you do more sales or sales presentations that involve that, right? So a quote's pretty cut or dry. You might have some discount lines in there. You might have a different number of things, but generally quotes are pretty black and white. They're just going to be PDFs or papers that you send, invoices that you might send. Now, one thing that I recommend with quoting and something that you can do a little bit better is I don't just send it via email and forget it, or just reply back to them saying, hey, quotes in your inbox, right? I don't do that. I try to present quotes as often as possible because you can walk people through things a little bit more and ask questions, right? Quotes have a lot of different language, or they should, like let's say, for example, how long the quote is good for. Now that is going to dictate a lot of your follow-up actions, right? Because a lot of time people will get quotes and then deals will go silent, or it takes a long time for those deals to progress, right? So a big question strategically is, should you have quotes that expire? And I think absolutely yes, you should. Now, depending on your product, service, or industry that you're in, the quote might not necessarily expire in 10 or 15 days. It might be 30 to 60 days. I generally don't do anything outside of 90 days for a quote before it expires and you have to re-look at that pricing, but that's just my preference. If we move on to SOWs, that becomes a little bit more catered and you got to put more work into those. So what differentiates an SOW from a quote is that an SOW is going to be more service-based. Now, SOW stands for Statement of Work, and in those documents, you're going to present not only your pricing or your quote, but you're going to present more about your company and how you understand their company and how you will solve their problems and how you plan on doing that. It's going to have things on your deliverables and your timing and your SLAs or service level agreements. It's going to have a lot of that language inside of an SOW. It's also going to have a signature page. So you treat SOWs really similar to quotes in terms of how they can be executed, meaning a client can sign them and send them back. But an SOW is going to have a lot more involved in it. Again, I never ever just send an SOW and say, hey, take a look at it. I always try to say, I've got your SOW ready. Do you have 30 minutes or an hour to review it? If I can walk somebody through an SOW, or I can teach clients how to do that, then immediately they can kind of sense where that buyer is with it, answer those questions, make any changes, or note any changes that need to be made to that SOW to make sure that it's pretty ironclad. An SOW is also great because it's going to help protect you and your company as well. So not only is it going to outline your deliverables and what the client will be getting for their money, but it also will be able to show what they will not be getting. And that's really important. A lot of people forget that. It's not just about what the client gets, it's also about what they don't get. You want those expectations to be set so that there's a lot less gray area or a lot less frustration as the deal progresses or once it gets to closing and you start delivering on that. SOWs are also often more designed. I always like to put at least branding, letterheads, and templates, to make sure that they look really nice and they represent your brand really nicely. I don't just do a PDF and send it out, right? I'll put visuals where appropriate, or I'll try to outline things a little bit more so that it just looks nicer and it feels better. It's higher fidelity. Lastly, if we get to an RFP, now that's request for proposal, or you might get what's called an RFI, which is request for information, which generally those lead to RFPs anyway, and in some cases they'll act as RFPs no matter what. Now an RFP, generally everybody hates those. Now I myself am not wild about them. They take a lot of effort and it's really not guaranteed. In fact, RFPs are going to be one of those where you have the least chance of winning, but you have to put the most work into them. Now, there's a lot of different flavors of RFPs, and I've heard this from a lot of different sales reps. Well, hey, Brian, I can just rinse and repeat these. RFPs don't take a whole lot of work. And that's generally for industries where they're selling literally the same thing, right? So when I worked for the federal government and I was selling things, they would put out RFPs for specific software or hardware they needed. In those, they would have part numbers. So it's pretty kind of cut and dry on, hey, this is what we need. We need 200 of these server stacks and we need, blah, blah, blah software licenses, right? When that would happen, essentially you want to make sure that you had deal registration first, meaning that all of these people, submitting bids for this RFP would be getting them from essentially the same suppliers, and the first one to register the deal would generally get a little bit better pricing, so that if everybody went in with the same price, your margins were a little bit better, so maybe you could discount it a little bit and still make money. So a lot of times federal government is kind of pricing based, but it's not always the case. And I've seen it happen a lot where not only do they want the RFP, but that's also going to lead to presentations on your product or solution. So again, there's a lot of different ways this can go, and it varies on if it's a service or a product or whatnot, right? But RFPs are generally, at least from a government perspective, kind of boring. You still want to try to design and lay these out as much as you possibly can. Now, the problem with RFPs is they're going to come pretty prescribed, meaning on that RFP, they're going to show you or tell you exactly what they need on your response. They're going to tell you exactly the format, exactly the sections. They're going to lay out everything on this is what you do. And if you don't follow that, that could be grounds for dismissal. And that's super frustrating because it doesn't always put you or your company in the best light. If they're looking at 50 different proposals and they all look the same, how do you differentiate? Well, a lot of that comes, earlier in the process where to get on the list anyway, you're selling and you're developing relationships inside of that organization. But you also want to be looking at the RFP and not just treating it as a literal just, okay, here's a template, we're going to put our pricing in, we're going to send it off. Are there options? Are there contacts on that RFP? Maybe you ask for a little bit more information. Are you reviewing the RFP in detail and coming up with any kind of questions, right? Can you help say, hey, listen, you wanted, this particular product or service, but we actually really recommend that you up the quantity to this, and we want to be able to explain why, because it's actually better for you in the long run. Are there ways or options in an RFP for you to do that? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Most RFPs that I have done recently have been healthcare related for large 7-figure deals in which an RFP itself is 80 pages long. We have to do a lot of work in those RFPs to present. So that means those RFPs, similar to SOWs when you can, that needs to be really personalized and catered to that client, okay? And this is assuming it's not just a government RFP where you have to submit it on their government site, right? Again, lots of flavors. That's why I get a lot of pushback from different salespeople, thinking that RFPs are just garbage and super easy to do. But there's a lot of instances where you have to put more time and effort into these, right? So I would always start off with some kind of template that's going to have company information and all that good stuff on it. But then over the next, 50, 60, 70 pages, it's going to outline what the solution is, especially if it's something like a website for a large healthcare organization, a multi-billion-dollar healthcare organization. There's a lot that goes into that. RFPs are one of those things that generally have a fast turnaround time, which gives them a bad reputation. Another thing to look out for when you're doing RFPs is who is issuing the RFP. Is it the company, or have they hired an external third party to do their RFP and their procuring process for them? If it's the latter, that actually really stinks, right? And I hate dealing with that because most of the time that company, it's pretty far disconnected from what what their client actually needs from a product or service standpoint. Sure, they might be well-versed in the process of creating and issuing RFPs, but they don't know enough to ask the right questions. So RFPs actually, they'll lead to the wrong product or service or a poor deliverable down the line, right? I've lost on RFPs or had clients lose on RFPs only to have that same company come back a year later saying, hey, it just didn't work out. Can you now give us an SOW, or we're going to do a new RFP process, right? RFPs are becoming super common because everybody thinks that they need to have a competitive bidding process. And especially if you're a public company, right? Government, public healthcare, those kind of things. Most of the time, especially if you're state run, you are required to have a competitive process or an RFP, right? A lot of private companies and smaller companies now are thinking, oh, we need to have an RFP too. And if they want to have a competitive process, they automatically define that as an RFP process, even though it may be informal and not really the same thing as, a request for proposal process in that formal way. So if you're doing any of these, quotes, SOWs, RFPs, congrats, that's awesome, okay? At least you're on the list to try and get some business and they came to you. RFPs a lot of times will just randomly come because companies will do research and if you're SEO optimized, which I can show you how to do, you'll show up on search engines and you'll become a vendor on their list. But you still have to do a lot of selling before and after, and that's what I don't want you to lose sight of. Just because it's a pretty stale process or pretty prescribed process, it's black and white on what you can and cannot do, try your best to find ways to keep communicating with them, keep making yourself top of mind, and keep reviewing the document and offering suggestions so that you can put your best proposal forward. If you have any questions on bidding on work or how you might approach that, please just reach out to me and I'll be happy to walk you through and give you at least my 2 cents on how I would approach whatever deal you're trying to get. I'll talk to you next time. See you later.